All right, as promised, we get into that conversation on Beijing at 30. That is 30 years after the Beijing conference. As promised, I'm joined now by Professor Wanjiku Kabira and Anne Mbwere. I'll begin with you, Professor Kabira. This, in my reading, I saw that there was a Nairobi document from 1985. So this journey to the Beijing conference, the agenda, is it accurate? Am I accurate in my understanding that it began 10 years before 1995? All right, I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon, Professor Kabira. I think you might be on mute, but before we hear from her, let's quickly glance at her profile. Now, she is a professor emeritus, and that is for literature, and she was the director of African Women's Studies at the University of Nairobi. She is also the leader Women's Economic Empowerment Hub at the University of Nairobi. In addition to that, she was Vice Chair, Constitution of Kenya Review Commission in the early 2000s, and between 2002 and 2011, she was the chair of the Women Political Alliance. She is also a prolific author and is widely published, but for the purposes of this conversation, I'll just highlight one of her publications, A Time for Harvest, Women and Constitution Making in Kenya. Let's also quickly take a glance at the profile of Anne Mbwere. And she served, as I mentioned at the start of this news hour, as commissioner, and that is in the State Department of Gender and Social Studies. But before there was a Ministry of Gender, she was the head of the Secretariat Women's Bureau when Kenya was heading to Beijing, Ministry of Culture and Social Services. I'm sure you heard about a delegation of 500 women carrying chondos. She'll reflect on that as well. And in addition to that, she served for, I think, was it 20 years? You let us know, as the former chair of Jamii Sacco. So since we have you on screen, Anne, perhaps you can tell us what your reflections of that time, 1995. A Kenyan women, a delegation of 500 women armed with chondos. What do you remember about that time?
Yeah, when we were preparing to participate in the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, China, we had a secretariat as a country, which I headed, and the chairperson was the late Grace Ogot. And so we were doing two things. One thing was to prepare the national report that we were to present at the conference in terms of the progress that we had made, in terms of implementation of the Nairobi forward-looking strategies, and also the gaps. And then also to prepare the delegation of both eminent women that came from the various thematic areas of concern, and also the rural women, because we felt it was necessary to take with us prominent leaders from all the districts in Kenya.
All right. So, in my reading, I came across... let me just find it here. My reading of the declaration, as well as the call for action, I came across in 1985 the Nairobi forward-looking strategies for the advancement of women. How did that inform what was on the agenda for the Beijing conference?
Well, you see, the Nairobi forward-looking strategies, this was a strategy document that was adopted at that conference, which would progressively guide the process of elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, and also to ensure improvement of their status in society in various sectors of development at the national, regional, and international levels among member states of the UN. So this is really what guided what was the content of the Nairobi forward-looking strategies. Specifically, we were looking at women in education, women in health, women in environment, women and representation, stroke decision making, women and financial inclusion, gender-based violence, women and economic development, and women and media. So we are giving reports of the progress that we had made and also the gaps that still had to be filled, and to agree on the way forward in terms of addressing those gaps.
Did you expect that the 1995 conference would be so pivotal where women's rights are concerned?
Yes, because during the decade, which was declared in 1975 in Mexico, where we had been working on it steadily because the government had set up the Women's Bureau. So we had been working on it steadily. And therefore, when we came up with these Nairobi forward-looking strategies, we knew that now we were on the process of advancing the status of women in all sectors of development. So it was vital, but we had to do a lot of work on it. Not only the government, but also the NGOs, the women groups, everybody was involved.
All right, I'll bring in Professor Kabira at this point. I believe your sound should have been resolved. Professor Kabira, what do you remember about that women's conference in 1995? Where did it find you? I believe you had you gotten your, yes, you were at the University of Nairobi at the time, or where were you at the time? Where did it find you? You know, did you have a role to play?
By the way, the 1985 conference, can you hear me?
I can, very clearly. Go ahead.
You can, okay. The 1985 conference was, the NGO conference itself was held at the University of Nairobi. It was chaired by Professor Ed Agashukia, and there were many, you know, it was really very, very well organized. And I'm referring to it because I think if you look at the forward-looking strategies that were adopted in Nairobi, they informed what actually happened in Beijing. Studying the two documents actually tells you that the African women plus the women in the third world, or the South, you know, the global South, have actually set the global agenda for women's empowerment. And you can see that if you compare both the documents, you'll see training and capacity building is crucial. In poverty, getting rid of poverty and promoting women's economic empowerment is actually pivotal in both documents. Issues related to leadership, media, you know, and so on, and even issues like water, health, and so on are actually major in both documents. I think if you, in my view, that for Africa, for instance, the 1985 taking place in Nairobi gave the African women the opportunity to reflect and prepare very well for the conference in the next decade, and coordinated, by the way, through Dakar in 1994, you know, where they prepared together to present the African perspective on the issues related to women. If you remember, the 1980s and 90s, by the way, in the continent, there were a lot of women's movement dealing with constitutional reform, women's rights, and so on. I think Kenya is a very good example. Maybe you might remember 1992, February, when the women had their first conference after the 1985, their first conference at KICC, where they actually set the agenda for affirmative action, for their own affirmative action, particularly for political participation. And it was a very, very well attended conference where we had people like Wangari Maathai, Phoebe Asio, Martha Karua, Gilu, Maria Nzomo, and others organizing themselves to ensure that they participate fully in politics. And I don't think the Kenyan women went back, you know, after that 1992 conference. So there is a sense in which the international conferences, like 1975 in Mexico, although only a few went to Mexico, Jane Kiano, Julia Ujiabo, Edgar Shukia, who went to Mexico in 1975. But having the conference in Africa also helped the women to come together in Africa and begin thinking about the African agenda for women. And I think you can see how the continent has moved. Many of the countries, including South Africa, Uganda, Ethiopia, even other countries in West Africa, generated particularly their constitutions within the next decade. So I think there's a sense in which you can see the path from 1975 to 1985 and then 1995, where the path for women's empowerment, particularly political leadership, rights within the constitution and so on, have been very well mapped out. And African women have spoken broadly in one voice. All right. During that period.
Okay, I'll come to you on the question of political inclusion. But Anne, given you were at the helm of Jamii Sacco for 20 years, I believe, as the chair, how far have we come in the last 30 years where women's economic empowerment is concerned? And I know, Professor Kabira, you'll also have something to say about that because of the Women's Economic Empowerment Hub at the University of Nairobi. But let's start with you, Anne.
Yes, in terms of economic empowerment, I think as a country, we've made very good progress. You find that our women, both girls, go to school, and then you are able to get a job, and you're able now to own property. You can buy your own property and have it in your name. We also find that women are into businesses. We find that a lot of women are running big shops. Like we know, Mama Ida is running this company, Spectre International, that manufactures gas cylinders. And then you find that they also have access to finances. In fact, accessing finance is no longer an issue because you find that a lot of women are in circles, they can get loans and do their own economic empowerment. You find that this government has also come up with a lot of funds for women, like the WEF Fund, and the banks have also opened up. So you find that women are able to access finances and do businesses and invest and make money for themselves. And then you find that even in terms of jobs, women are also involved in a wide spectrum of economic engagement, like you find that even in chamas, even small scale chamas, they get money there, table banking, and they're able to make money for themselves. And you find that women now are even doing jobs that were a preserve for men, like you find women will be touts. You find some women are working as petrol pump operators, and there's nothing that women cannot do now. So in terms of economic empowerment, I think we've done well. Although we always say that there's room for improvement, but I think we've done very well in terms of economic empowerment, just getting money for ourselves. And then you find that women no longer just sit in the house. Even in Nairobi here, you find that if the man goes to work, the woman will also do their own little businesses, maybe make mandazi, sell vegetables, so that they can also complement the family income. So I think we've done well in terms of economic empowerment for women.
All right. Professor Kabira, how about where political inclusion is concerned?
I think, okay, let me just, maybe for continuity, just talk a little bit about economic empowerment, because I think those two issues are very, very critical for women's progress. Political participation, where being at the table where decisions are being made, and also, economic empowerment, because if you are not economically empowered, even the rights that you might have, you may not even be able to utilize them. I think it is true, like Anne has said, there has been some progress. We can see even within the public sector, within the private sector, women leading in major, business enterprises like Kenya, like the Kenya, quite a number of the banks, as well as other private enterprises, private companies, and so on. I was thinking about, some of the companies which are very important, like this Sylvia Mulingi, who has actually been at the, very senior in Safaricom, and now taking charge of this, the equivalent of Safaricom in Uganda and other places. And I think we are getting women in those leadership positions. And it's a very, very important thing, but it's because of the investment that has also been made in their education and political participation. When we come to ordinary Kenyans, ordinary women, I still think we have a long way to go. The percentages for women's ownership, in spite of the land laws and the boards and so on, is still quite low. Their ownership is still quite, or properties generally is low. And very often, even when the rights they have in the Constitution, they are not able to utilize them because of cultural differences, cultural attitudes, gender stereotypes, and so on. For instance, you have many women who are not even able to go to court because their brothers have refused to share the land when the parents die and so on. So we have a long way to go. I've just come from Kilifi, where we are doing some projects on value addition. And when you go to the women's groups, you realize that they need financial inclusion. I think we are still struggling to find the best way of supporting women in terms of financial inclusion. Many banks are not supporting women's groups. They prefer to support individuals because with women's groups, they think that because they are not companies and so on, you cannot sue them. So they are slow in supporting them. So you will find them struggling sometimes with their 100 shillings, contributions per week, getting to 400. And by the time you actually have enough, a substantial amount of money, even to do a group activity, it is quite difficult. I think now with the Women Enterprise Fund, Youth Fund, even with GAF, I think, we still need to find a good way of actually financially supporting the women at the grassroots level, majority of the women, so that we can raise their status from just surviving to becoming economically empowered.
Okay, and finally, on the question of political inclusion?
On the question of political participation, I think we did well. We have done well so far in terms of trying to get to the 30% representation, because the affirmative action is actually supposed to be a ground for training. So you can see that there are young women who are getting into parliament, sometimes through affirmative action, but the next time, they come through, the common, if you like, the elections and so on. I think we have made progress in that area. And I believe that there are many things. If you look at some of the laws that have been brought by women in parliament, many have actually come that support, child care work, for instance. They support women's, even reproductive rights, general rights of women supported by, the women members of parliament, Millie Odiabo and others actually articulate the issues of women very well. And I think we are making progress in that area. Hopefully, we are going to get to a stage where we can say now we are moving towards 50%, and not talking about the 33%, which is the affirmative action, provision. And also at the county level, I think the women are getting there. We are getting 30%, but there is need to invest much more in capacity building so that they are able to influence the changes at that level. But leadership is broad. I think we are getting women leaders in many other areas. They are becoming much more visible, even in the boards and so forth. And you also find that, even as chiefs or even in the police, it's good to see the general in the army, the Fatuma and others. So I think we are getting there in terms of leadership, but it will take quite a bit of time while the institutions change, because sometimes you get handicapped by the way the institutions themselves work, the way they operate, the kind of policies they have, and you find that you are not able to thrive in that space, but we are getting there. We have made quite a bit of progress, and the constitutions have been contributed very significantly, not just here in Kenya, in Uganda, in South Africa, in many other African countries.
All right. Let me thank you for your contribution to that struggle, Professor Wanjiku Kabira. And we also have Anne Ambwere online, on call in the studio, joining us virtually. So thank you, ladies, for your contribution to, let me call it, the struggle. As they say, the struggle continues. We take a break, and Citizen Weekend will continue on the other side of this break as well.